From my perspective, what we've been doing since the end of World War II is building an empire. And today we have managed to build the world's first truly global empire. It's the first in the history of the world. And it's also the first empire that's really been built without the military for the most part. It's been built through economics, through economic hitmen like me. The military has been there standing in the background, prepared to go in to serve us, to take care of things when we failed. But it's been essentially built through economics. Instead of an empire, what we have today, and what's been growing stronger and stronger since World War II, is what I call the corporatocracy. And this is a fairly small group of mostly men who run our biggest corporations. And through them, they run our government and practically every other government in the world, all the important ones in the world. They are the equivalent of the empire. And they are in control regardless of whether we have a Republican or a Democrat in the White House or controlling Congress. They are in control. Certain things may be different with a Republican and a Democrat. For example, the Supreme Court, people that are put on that, there's differences. But as far as building this empire is concerned, it continues under all those regimes. And this is what we must change. And so how do we economic hitmen work? Well, the most common way, and Dave just read a bit of that, is that we will identify a country, a third world country, that has resources that our corporations covet, like oil. And then we'll arrange a huge loan to that country from an organization like the World Bank. But this loan doesn't go to the country. Instead, it goes to U.S. corporations, Halliburton, Bechtel, Brown and Root, you know the names. Those are the ones that get the money. And they build big infrastructure projects in this country, power plants, ports, highways, industrial parks, things that benefit the very rich who are in collaboration with the corporatocracy, but they don't benefit the poor. The poor aren't connected to the power grids. They don't have the skills to get the jobs in the industrial parks. They don't own cars to drive on the highways or ships to use in the ports. The country's left holding a huge debt, so huge you can't possibly repay it. So at some time, we economic hitmen go back and say to the country, listen, you can't pay your debts, so give us a pound of flesh. Sell oil to our oil companies real cheap, or vote with us on the next critical United Nations vote, or send troops in support of ours to some place in the world like Iraq. And in that way, we've built this empire. There's a lot of other things we've done, but that's the most common and most typical one.
Debt as a mechanism of control, I think, is the way you've put it. And it's worth for your listeners and viewers to sort of understand, why is it that the African continent in many ways seems to be addicted to debt? It looks like it's addicted to debt. But I think it's important to understand that history has gotten us to this point, right? So the history of colonialism, the history of imperialism, the current moments of neocolonialism have gotten us into this kind of situation where many of our countries are always lacking in the sufficient capital to do what they need to do, right? So, countries need to put up infrastructure. We need to invest in hospitals, schools, roads, electricity, the kind of stuff that's really important and a precondition for development. But we do not have sufficient capital internally. Why is it that we don't have sufficient capital internally? Because a lot of our capital is spirited away to the West, right? So we then find ourselves in this kind of situation where we are capital deficient. And because we're capital deficient, we then have to borrow. Not unlike the situation of like a low wage worker who is exploited and extracted, and they have no choice but to go to a payday lender, as is the case in the US, right? So this is similar to to the African situation. And because of that, we go through these cycles of debt. And that debt, like you were saying, Eugene, is used as a mechanism of control. It's a mechanism of subordination and all those kinds of things. We have to understand. So essentially, the IMF, the World Bank, and other international financial institutions, particularly the IMF and the World Bank, when an idea that came out of the establishment of the United Nations, right? So when the United Nations was established right after Second World War, there was a thinking. And I think, it's a bit tricky to assess whether the United Nations has been a net good or not. But I think it for a while the UN did play quite an important role. I think, for example, the movement to politically decolonize many countries in Africa, for example. I mean, that idea was given quite some credence by the UN. Anyway, so the World Bank and the IMF came out of this settlement after Second World War. And the idea itself was a good idea. The idea was essentially to say, look, we are always going to have crisis of one form or the other. And as brothers and sisters, we need to look out for each other. So we're going to establish two organizations, the World Bank to finance long-term development, and then the IMF to sort out short-term financial crises like the one that Lebanon is going through, or the one that many countries in the global south are going through. So a great idea on paper. Now the sad thing is that this great idea on paper became captured by the US and Western Europe. Right, it became geopoliticized. These two entities became tools of projecting Western power, and that's why it's no surprise that the IMF is headquartered in Washington, D.C., the World Bank is headquartered in Washington, D.C., President of the World Bank is effectively picked by the President of the U.S., and President of the World Bank is effectively picked by the Managing Director of the IMF is effectively picked by Europeans, right? So one has to understand this. And because of this, and because there's this, the West wants to maintain dominance, economic dominance. It's useful for capitalism, for example, to have subservient countries to provide the raw materials that powers the engines in the center, in the core, in the metropole, right? So all this, when you think about all this stuff, it then makes sense to have austerity, right? For the IMF to swoop into a country in the global south, instead of saying you're in an economic crisis moment and you ought to be spending more, particularly on the poor, particularly on the working class, particularly on marginalized communities. That's what you ought to be doing. After all, that's what often happens in the West. When there's an economic crisis, you don't do austerity, you do the reverse. But again, it all makes sense why the IMF comes over here and they say, cut spending on health, education, and those kinds of things, precisely because we want to maintain you in a state of perpetual subservience.
The Kiel Institute in Germany has just released their new database on African debt, and there's a range of things that it reveals. But one of the things I thought was interesting is they examined the rates of interest of the various types of loans, and of course the private loans were significantly higher than almost everything else coming from the bond market, and so on and so forth. And they were noting that some of the African countries have become so trapped in these debt cycles that they're taking out lower interest loans to pay off the higher interest loans, and it's just an unbelievable cycle, so that almost nothing is really being paid towards the actual needs of the country to some degree. It just now becomes, as you said, like a payday lender.
There's a core fundamental issue, which is that a lot of countries in the global south, particularly in Africa, are deficient in capital, in sort of funds to fund these large-scale development projects. Eugene, you can't develop without sufficient electric power. You can't develop without laying out a road network, without a communications infrastructure. These things are incredibly critical. And many of these countries, again, were dealt bad set of cards from colonialism, because all that colonialism did was build infrastructure that supported the extraction of raw materials to feed the beast in the West, right? So a lot of these countries are trying to play catch up, right? And they're desperate for capital. The World Bank was supposed to be performing this role of supplying long-term capital at very low interest rates, at what they call concessional interest rates. But the World Bank, for geopolitical reasons, like I just illustrated a short while ago, a tool of Western power, doesn't want to do that, because if the World Bank does its job properly, then a lot of these countries in the global south will be self-sustaining, they'll stand on their own, and then nobody can push them around. So, because the World Bank hasn't been performing this role, right, a lot of loan sharks or Shylocks or whatever you want to call them have popped out of the woodworks, right? So it is not the case that the Zambian government, for example, chose to go borrow from private lenders at high interest rates. That wasn't a choice they made. They were forced into doing that, precisely because of the reasons that I've just given. And so that's what explains this sort of different profile of lenders. Right, it is a reaction or response to the fact that the multilateral institutions that are supposed to coordinate all this for us in a brotherly and sisterly way, in a peaceable way, haven't been doing it. And therefore, Again, I like this analogy of payday lending. Folks don't go to payday lenders because they want to. They do it because they're shut out of the actual form of financial system, either they have high credit scores as a result of racism, discrimination, all sorts of stuff. So I think that's important to illustrate. One of the most interesting things, Eugene and Rania, is that when you do a survey on the African continent and you ask, say, the typical African and say, what's your view of China, right? And surveys have been done on this. Many people respond by saying, we're kind of favorable. And it makes sense. Why would they say this? Because they can kind of see the fruits of our interactions with China. If you come to many African capital cities, Eugene, you see that the infrastructure landscape has changed. You can see highways, you can see hospitals, you can see power stations. And then many are asking the question, we've been dealing with the US for quite a while now. We've been dealing with Britain for quite a while now. But we've never really seen we've never seen this kind of tangible fruits of friendship, right? So I think this is what's going on here. And I think China is being blamed when the truth is much more complex. And when China has really been trying to play ball. In the era of COVID, for example, when COVID broke, China was one of the first countries, and I think one of the few countries, to suspend interest payments on debt that was owed to it, right? Yep. So I mean, this is some of the complexity in there, and also there's geopolitical posturing, the fact that there's a new kid on the block.
Nice idea, but it won't help. It'll just formalize the reality that poor countries can never repay their loans.
Senator, are you saying that you're opposed to debt relief for impoverished countries?
No, we should forgive the debts, but that's not going to help those countries very much.
Okay. What will?
Some African tax rates are the highest in the world. In Tanzania, the 30% rate kicks in at $475 of income. Plus, they have a 20% value-added tax. It gets added to everything you buy. Those high tax rates make it impossible to build capital in those countries. So nothing gets built, not factories, not roads, not anything. Poor African countries have the lowest wage workers in the world. And yet a company like Nike, for instance, can't put a factory in one of those countries because of the oppressive tax rates. Taxes have killed any possibility of economic development. They've killed any hope of these countries ever helping themselves. And that leaves them completely at the mercy of charity and loans. And here's the worst part. You know why those countries have such high tax rates? Because of us. To show us that they can raise enough money to pay back their loans. But taxes can't raise any money if they kill the economies. So it turns out that the tragic, unintended consequence of our good intentions toward Africa, our kindness, is that we have encouraged those countries to lock themselves into a gruesome economic depression. If we don't urge those countries to cut their tax rates, they will never grow their economies. People will live lifetimes of unemployment. Disease will be rampant, poverty will be permanent, and children will be hungry. And our charity will never be enough. Never.
Our ability to create and sustain economic growth is the defining challenge of our time. Economic growth, as we know, is a key driver for the development of social spending in education, healthcare, infrastructure, and of course in our ability to attack issues around climate change. Economic growth is also absolutely critical if we are able to create an opportunity for human progress, innovation, and improvements in living standards. Economic growth is also important as a glue and gel to ensure that we have social cohesion and that society does not fracture. Unfortunately, in order for us to increase per capita incomes and to double them within one generation, which is approximately 25 years, we need economic growth in a country to be around 7% per year. No country of import or of size is growing at that 7% rate today. Most critics of the blind pursuit for economic growth using the capitalist model will argue that capitalism has been bad and has actually created more corruption, a petulance in the environment, has actually created the financial crisis, and has been an impetus and a catalyst for populism. I am here today to argue that we require economic growth, and that growth is critical and powerfully important if we are to address the key economic headwinds that the world faces. These include, in no particular order, technology and the risk of the jobless underclass because of automation. But it also requires that we must focus on making sure that we don't create a splinter net between a Chinese-led and a US-led technology platform. It also means that we have to focus on demographics, and economic growth can help us focus on issues around demographics. According to the United Nations, there will be 11 billion people on the planet by 2100. India is adding 1 million people a month to its population. In order to address demographics, we must continue to drive economic growth. Income inequality, another issue that is of key importance. The reality is we have seen the erosion of social mobility in countries like the United States by as much as 50% over the last several decades. Unfortunately, there's a danger that public policy is reaching for short-term solutions, such as tax and redistribution, as a way to solve income inequality. And then there's natural resource scarcity and the real concerns around climate change. Of course, we now all understand that risk, but we also need to appreciate that today, as many as 1.2 billion people around the world do not have access to cost savings or sustainable energy around the world. There is a temptation, I know, for us to focus on the immediate issues today, such as trade wars and protectionism. However, I implore you that we must act to drive economic growth, and most importantly, we must accept that ideology is the enemy of growth, and we have to be much more open-minded in terms of our ideas and thinking if we are to see economic progress in the years to come.
Too often in foreign aid, you're rewarding people for doing all the wrong things. That is, you're willing to lavish foreign aid on Tanzania because they have bungled so many things and people are on the edge of starvation. You are not willing to send foreign aid to the Ivory Coast because they've done things that worked out. And so you're subsidizing irresponsibility. But I've discovered the very same thing a decade ago in looking at programs for minority students in the United States. It's a certain mindset that you see in every area, that you want to give help to those who need it most. And often what that means is not someone who was more disadvantaged at the outset, but someone who was more irresponsible in dealing with a situation. But the other thing that happens too with foreign aid is that you subsidize counterproductive policies. It becomes easier then for people to oppress those minorities in their countries who have the entrepreneurship. And even in very poor countries, there are often groups who do have this entrepreneurship, either part of the majority of the society or particular groups like the Chinese, the East Indians in East Africa, the Igbos in Nigeria, the Lebanese in a number of countries. And what the political leaders can do is repress, and in some cases engage in mass expulsions of those people who have all the skills that are needed in the country. And then foreign aid will come in and rescue them from the consequences of having done that.
In Africa, more than anywhere else in the world, the difference that just one good leader can make is much greater than anywhere else. And here's why. It's because in Africa we have weak institutions like the judiciary, the constitution, civil society, and so forth. So here's a general rule of thumb that I believe in. When societies have strong institutions, the difference that one good leader can make is limited. But when you have weak institutions, then just one good leader can make or break that country. Let me make it a bit more concrete. You become the president of the United States. You think, wow, I've arrived. I'm the most powerful man in the world. So you decide, perhaps let me pass a law. All of a sudden, Congress taps you on the shoulder and say, no, you can't do that. You say, let me try this way. The Senate comes and says, we don't think you can do that. You say, perhaps, let me print some money. I think the economy needs a stimulus. The central bank governor will think you're crazy. You might get impeached for that. But if you become the president of Zimbabwe, and you say, you know, I really like this job. I think I'd like to stay in it forever. Well, you just can. You decide you want to print money, you call the central bank governor and say, please, double the money supply. He'll say, okay, yes, sir. Is there anything else I can do for you? This is the power that African leaders have. And this is why they make the most difference on the continent. The good news is that the quality of leadership in Africa has been improving. We've had 3 generations of leaders in my mind. Generation 1 are those who appeared in the 50s and 60s. These are people like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Julius Nyerere of Tanzania. The legacy they left is that they brought independence to Africa. They freed us from colonialism, and let's give them credit for that. They were followed by Generation 2. These are people that brought nothing but havoc to Africa. Think warfare, corruption, human rights abuses. This is the stereotype of the typical African leader that we typically think of. Mobutu Sese Seko from Zaire, Sani Abacha from Nigeria. The good news is that most of these leaders have moved on, and they were replaced by Generation 3. These are people like the late Nelson Mandela and most of the leaders that we see in Africa today, like Paul Kagame and so forth. Now, these leaders are by no means perfect. But the one thing they have done is that they've cleaned up much of the mess of Generation 2. They've stopped the fighting, and I call them the stabilizer generation. They're much more accountable to their people. They've improved macroeconomic policies. And we're seeing for the first time, Africa's growing, and in fact, it's the second fastest growing economic region in the world. So these leaders are by no means perfect, but they are by and large the best leaders we've seen in the last 50 years. So where to from here? I believe that the next generation to come after this, Generation 4, has a unique opportunity to transform the continent. Specifically, they can do 2 things that previous generations have not done. The first thing they need to do is they need to create prosperity for the continent. Why is prosperity so important? Because none of the previous generations have been able to tackle this issue of poverty. Africa today has the fastest growing population in the world, but also is the poorest. By 2030, Africa will have a larger workforce than China, and by 2050, it'll have the largest workforce in the world. 1 billion people will need jobs in Africa. So if we don't grow our economies fast enough, we're sitting on a ticking time bomb, not just for Africa, but for the entire world. The second thing that this generation needs to do is to create our institutions. They need to build these institutions such that we're never held to ransom again by a few individuals like Robert Mugabe.
I would go to countries with resources our corporations covet, like oil. I'd arrange a huge loan to those countries from the World Bank or its sister organizations, but the money wouldn't actually go to the country. It would go to our corporations, Bechtel, Halliburton, Brown and Root, familiar names, to build big infrastructure projects in those countries and incidentally make huge profits in the process. They'd build power plants and industrial parks, things that would benefit a few wealthy families in the country, the ones that own the industries. But the majority of the people would suffer. They would be left holding a huge debt they couldn't repay. So we'd go back and say, since you can't pay your debt, sell your resource, oil or whatever, real cheap to our corporations. Privatize. Sell your utilities, your schools, your jails, everything like that to our corporations. And Claudine also told me that if the leaders of these countries refused my offer, people she called jackals would be right behind me. And so every time I stumbled, and I stumbled often, somebody was there to pick me up. A government official would appear with an incredible report that would indicate beyond any shadow of a doubt that electricity was all the country needed to take off to huge growth. A Harvard-trained mathematician showed up with a mathematical formula that proved that if they just built this electrical system, everything would be fine. In the end, I produced a report that forecasts the need for electricity at an unheard of annual rate of 19%. I'm a capitalist. I think that capitalism has given us incredible technology, like art, science, medicine. And I think it holds out the hope for the future. But there's this new form of capitalism that I call predatory capitalism. That's the enemy of true capitalism. But let me explain. When I was in business school, I was taught that a good CEO makes a decent rate of return for his company and also makes sure his company is a good citizen. He pays his workers a fair wage, gives them health insurance and retirement pensions, pays taxes, imagine that, and supports local school and recreational facilities and so on and so forth. And in essence, he makes sure that his company serves a public interest. That all changed in 1976 when Milton Friedman won the Nobel Prize in economics and stated, amongst many other things, the only responsibility of business is to maximize profits, regardless of the social and environmental costs. It changed everything. And it has created this global fiasco, what I believe we're headed toward this disaster where we're in it a lot now with the climate change, with all the things that we all know is happening, and we must change that. And we can change that. How? I think the American Revolution actually offers an interesting example. Back in 1773, most everybody in the United States believed that the British were invincible. But George Washington stepped forward, and he remembered 20 years earlier during the French and Indian War, he had witnessed at the Battle of the Monongahela the defeat of a huge, powerful British army by a handful of Indians. And Washington said, they're not invincible. All we got to do is hide behind trees. Change the rules. So I think that's where we're at today. Change the rules. I like the rules I learned in business school, that a good corporation, a good CEO should make sure that his corporation serves the public interest, is a good citizen. I like the idea that you and I should invest in corporations that, instead of essentially destroying the resources upon which our economy is based, instead of doing that, they clean up pollution, regenerate destroyed environments, develop new technologies for more efficient energy, transportation, communications, and just about everything else. In essence, let's get our corporations to create an economic system that is itself a renewable resource. You know, democracy depends upon transparency. It depends on understanding the story behind the story. It demands that you and I look for the story. It demands that we question our leaders and our government policies. That's the patriotic thing to do. So number one, look for, spread the story behind the story. Number two, use local, individual, and community power, your power, to change politics, to change the governmental system, to change the laws. We, the people, must do it. We can't wait for a president to do it, whoever the next president is. We have to do it, and that's our job in a democracy. Join an organization or start one that impacts local laws, national laws, global laws. Do it. Get involved, please. This is something important that we all can do. Get involved. So, shine a light, change the laws, and convince corporations to serve a public interest. And in that way, we're going to turn this economic system that is failing us, one that's exhausted, one that's devastating its own resource base, into a renewable resource. I think you and I live at the most amazing, important time in human history. We are going through a revolution, a consciousness revolution. People are waking up across the planet. Together, we're going to come together and we're going to create a world that my 8-year-old grandson and every other child of every sentient being on this planet is going to look back at and say, hey, thank God for TEDx in Michigan. Thank God all those people came together and committed to moving forward to creating an economic system that's a renewable resource.
Stay tuned. The stream is about to begin.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. When Lee Kuan Yew became Singapore's Prime Minister in 1959, Singapore was a struggling post-colonial port city with high unemployment rates, widespread poverty, and rampant social unrest. When he left office in 1990, it was a thriving global financial hub with a booming economy, world-class infrastructure, and a highly educated workforce. When Robert Mugabe came into power as Zimbabwe's Prime Minister in 1980, Zimbabwe was a newly independent nation full of hope and promise. When he left power in 2017, it was a country plagued by economic collapse, political repression, and widespread corruption. The leaders that we have matter. Their decisions color the very nature of our lives. The choices they make become the systems that run the engines of our society. Africa's future hangs in the balance. It will soon be the youngest and most populous continent on Earth. The decisions we make now can either lead to more poverty than the world has ever seen, or a bright future where Africa's wealth works for all Africans. The system is broken. Join us in trying to fix it with the impactful capitalist documentary on why Africa is poor, coming soon.